I've used and reviewed a lot of ECOFLOW products, and I love their River 2 series of solar generators or power stations or whatever you want to call them. And this is one of the 3 in the line that they have. I've reviewed the other 2. I've reviewed the River 2 and the River 2 Max, and this is the River 2 Pro. Now, I've been meaning to get around to this review for a while, but to be honest, I've just been using it too much, and you can see some of the battle scars that I've got. I'm not even going to clean that up. It just proves that I've been using this thing, and I love it. It's so handy. And in this video, we're going to review through this thing. If you want the short version, if you're looking for something about this capacity, and we'll talk about all the specs here in just a second, but if you're looking for something about this size, about this capacity, then just go get it. It's a great device. You can always find it on sale. I'll leave some links down below for the Amazon store. But if you want to see the full review, I'm going to go through all the specs. I'm going to test it out a little bit. So just sit right back, maybe grab a snack, and let's get into this. Hey everybody, it's Chris from Family Geekery, and today we're checking out the ECOFLOW River 2 Pro. Now before we even get started in looking at the specs and reviewing this thing, I just want to caution you that the naming convention that ECOFLOW has chosen for these is at times a little bit confusing. Now the easy one to remember is the ECOFLOW River 2. That's the little brother, and it's about probably this tall. This one is the ECOFLOW River 2 Pro, and this is the big brother. And it's got the highest capacity of all the River 2 products. And then in the middle is the ECOFLOW River 2 Max. So a little confusing that the Pro is a higher capacity and higher output than the Max. I would think that the Max would be, well, the Max. But once you get past remembering which one is which, I mean, obviously just look at them. And the biggest one is going to be the one with the highest capacity, highest power output. And the smallest one is going to be the smallest. But they all have very similar features between them, and the biggest thing that's going to differ between them all is going to be the power output and the battery capacity. Now I've done reviews, like I said, on the River 2 and the River 2 Max. If you want to check those out, I will link them down below. But I'm ready to talk about the Pro, so let's get into the specs. Alright, so starting off with the specs, we're going to talk about the outputs first, and that is obviously how much power this thing can output. We're going to start off with the AC ports here. So we've got 4 full-size grounded AC outlets. You can turn the AC function on and off with this button here, separate from the rest of the unit, and this power station is rated at 800 watts max. Now 800 watts out of the combined 4 ports here with a what they call boosted power output of 1600 watts. So if you have a device that just draws a whole lot of energy just to get it started, and then it continuously draws less than that, then this can produce up to 1600 watts short period and then 800 watts over time. The outlets here are spaced out enough that you can put little transformers on there, which is nice, and they are, like I said, fully grounded. Some of them have just the 2 prongs for half of the outlets and then 3 prongs for some of them. So you can definitely plug in plenty of things into the AC side of this. Now switching over to the DC side, we've got some USB ports over here. We've got 3 USB-A ports, which are 5 volts, 2.4 amps max, which are 12 watt ports. And then we've got the USB-C here, which is not only a 100 watt output, but it also serves as a 100 watt input. So it's got power delivery, many different voltages, 5 volts, 9 volts, 12 volts, 20 volts, all the way up to 100 watts max. And then on the right, we've got our other DC output, which is again individually turned on and off. And we've got the 12 volt cigarette lighter plug here, which can deliver up to 10 amps. And then we've got 2 of the little barrel plugs here, which can deliver 12 volts at 3 amps each. So a lot of options for outputs. Let's talk about the inputs next. Now before we turn this thing around and look at the main input ports, remember this USB-C is also an input. So if you have maybe even just a wall charger that delivers power delivery, and you want to make sure you use a proper cable, which is rated at 100 watts. And if you're lucky, it's even labeled on the front of the cable like this, then you can actually get 100 watts in here. Now the charging speed is obviously going to depend on how much power you're putting in, but even having a 100 watt input on the USB-C is a very nice convenience. So let's go ahead and flip this thing around and look at the main inputs. Alright, so the main inputs are going to be this AC input here, which obviously comes with a AC charging cable with the device. And then we've got this DC charging over here, which would be considered like the solar charger. This one over here, that's your main 100 to 120 volts AC, 50 or 60 hertz, and it's got a maximum of 940 watts. Now at that max of 940 watts, I say this thing will charge up in close to an hour from completely empty. I think it's like 70 minutes. And we're going to test that out. We're going to plug this thing up and charge it in a minute. But that is, obviously, that's a lot of power going in there in a fast manner. So you're going to hear the fans probably kick up on this thing when we're doing that. On the flip side here, we've got the DC input, which may be either a solar input or the included cable that comes with it is a cigarette lighter plug. So you can have this plugged into your car while you're driving down the road. And if you're charging from a cigarette lighter, you're probably looking at like 100 watts input, but it'll take up to 220 watts if you have the correct solar hookups. Now this unit doesn't come with solar cables, but depending on your panels, you can obviously find plenty of options for converting to this input here on Amazon or similar websites. Now all the specs that we just talked about are conveniently located on this little label on the back here. And I appreciate every time that they do something like that. That makes it handy to remember what ports are supplying what kind of output or input. Alright, so we talked about all the inputs and outputs, but the next most important thing to think about, and probably actually the most important thing to consider with these battery banks or power generators or solar generators, is their capacity. And simply put, the capacity is basically how much battery storage this has in here to continue to deliver power out of all these outputs here when it's not connected to any power. And capacity for these types of devices are measured in what's called watt hours, and this particular one has 768 watt hours of battery capacity. And if you think about what that means, we've got some amount of watts coming out of this thing for some duration of time, and that's what watt hours are. Now to keep math easy, if we think about this as being an 800 watt device, if we maxed out all these ports here at 800 watts, and we had that running for 1 hour, that would be 800 watt hours of power needed. Now if we rounded this 768 watt hour device up to 800 watt hours to make the math easy, then we know if we plugged in 800 watts worth of stuff in here, it would run it for 1 hour, and then it would run out of battery. So keeping with that simple math, if we only used 400 watts coming out of here, then it would run that for 2 hours. If we only had 200 watts coming out of here, it would run that for 4 hours. And if we had just 100 watts being used out of this, whether it's out of the DC port or one of the AC ports, then it could maintain that for close to 8 hours. Now again, that's just simple math. There is some efficiency as far as how efficient it is at taking the battery power and converting it into certain voltages of DC or certain voltages of AC. But just to keep things simple, if you're comparing different models of ECOFLOW or different models of these power generators, just know that the higher that number is in watt hours, the longer it's going to last. So with some basic math, you can figure this out on whatever device you're looking at. Most devices have some kind of a label on it that shows how much power it's outputting. So the DC output on this is about 150 watts total on this. This is just a laptop brick. So 150 watts, if that was maxed out, meaning that this power supply is putting out the total amount of power it can to that laptop for the whole time, then you can just do some easy math to divide that 768 watt hours by that 150 watts needed from that power brick and figure out how many hours this particular device would run that. So whether you have a CPAP machine or something that you need to figure out if it will run all night long, that's the easiest way to get an approximation. So now that we understand all the inputs and outputs and we understand the capacity, let's go ahead and test this thing out. Alright, next up we're going to test out some of the functions here, and to do so we're going to be using the included screen. We're going to take a look at the app later, but for right now we're going to do everything just right on the front. And we can see a couple different things already on the screen. We've got the main battery percentage right here, it's showing 90%. We've got an input and output amount of watts on the right, and they're both saying 0, obviously because nothing is happening. And then we've got the time here. Now the time is going to either count down as we're using more power than we're putting into it, or it's going to count up if we're charging this or putting more power into it than we're taking out. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to plug in the included AC cable and watch this thing ramp up and start charging. Alright, so I just plugged the cable in and it's going to start climbing up here, and we can see already it's up to 700 watts. And we are topping out around 880 or so, and we can see that this number here is starting to climb up, and it shows us on the left 12 minutes, and it's counted down to 11 minutes. And that's how long it's going to take to completely top off this all the way up to 99 or 100%. And it's climbing fast. So let me go ahead and unplug that, and I'm going to test out the USB-C input also. Alright, so to test out this USB-C input, I've got handy right here just a VoltMe charger. It's a kind of power travel strip thing, and it's got USB-C outputs on it. This one maxes out at 70 watts. So that's what I'm going to use here, and I am using the 100 watt cable to make sure that the cable is not the bottleneck. So let's go ahead and plug that into the USB-C port. And USB-C devices, power delivery devices, have to talk to each other and negotiate, hey, what's happening here? And it's decided this thing needs to charge this thing, and it's climbing up, and it's up to 65, 68 watts now. And of course it's going to show how many minutes it would take at that 68 watts to top that off. So if we left this charging for 10 minutes, then this thing should be up to 100%. So obviously if I had a 100 watt power supply handy here, this would be going up quicker. We'd have more power in, less time of recharging. But you may have a laptop charger or a tablet charger or something that you already own, and it's nice just to have the convenience and the options of charging this way. So let's test the USB output next. Alright, so now I've got the cable plugged into the USB-C here, and since it is an input and output, I'm able to charge out of there, and I'm going to be using this little battery here as a test load, and this is capable of both 100 watts input and output from this little tiny battery, which is awesome for flights if you got to keep your phone or tablet or even a laptop charged up. This is just great. So we're going to plug this in. Now there is a possibility that they will negotiate with each other and think that this thing needs to charge this thing, and that is a possibility, but hopefully it'll determine that this ECOFLOW is going to be charging this battery. And we lucked out, so we are showing an output here, and it's climbing up to 92 watts. And on this little guy right here, we can see the input showing up down in the bottom left hand corner there at about 87 watts. So there is probably a little calibration difference between the two, maybe a little bit of cable loss, but that's still pretty good. Getting 87 watts into this thing, we can see it's charging up pretty fast. It even shows 51%, and it shows hundredths of a percent, so that's always fun to watch charge up. But if we wanted to, we could charge these little guys right here for about 7 hours at that 100 watt output. Now I'm not going to demonstrate the USB-A ports. I think everybody knows what a 5 volt USB-A charger does. So I'm going to go ahead and set up a test for our AC outputs next. Alright, so anytime I want to go ahead and test out some kind of AC device that's going to draw a lot of power, I always just make a little trip into my kitchen, and I've got here my little dipper, which is perfect for making queso and stuff like that on Super Bowl Sunday. So I've got that plugged into the front here. I'm going to go ahead and push this AC on button, make that glow. And now once I turn this on, I'm going to turn it on to low first. And we're going to see we're getting about 86 watts of power draw. So let's go ahead and turn it up to high. And it's going to about 116. And we can see at 94%, we've got about 6 hours or so. And that's going to climb down a little bit once it figures out what the power output is. So about 4 hours or so of output. So if you're curious about how much queso you can make at the campground with your ECOFLOW River 2 Pro, I would say you can make about 4 hours worth. Now with this outputting out to the AC, I'm going to go ahead and plug in this charger again, and I want to see what the input shows versus the output, and then see how that affects our runtime here. Alright, so we are ramping up the power input, and we are actually going to climb up above that 940 watts because it's actually able to take in enough power to both charge this thing and send some out the output here at the same time. So some devices may call this like pass-through charging, and they have a feature built in that they don't call UPS mode, where if this was to lose power, it would automatically keep generating out this AC port here, and there is like a 20 millisecond cutover time in between losing the power and having this continue to go through. So the AC power is actually coming through here and making it to here without going through the batteries, but it is charging the batteries. But if it does lose power, then this is going to switch over to the batteries, like I said, in about 20 or 30 milliseconds. So a lot of people use devices like this or the smaller version of this to power up their cable modem and their Wi-Fi router. So if they lose power in the house, those things just kick right over and you can still have internet even when the power is out. Now I think you've probably heard the fan kick on in this thing, since it is getting about 900 and something watts going through this thing. That obviously produces a lot of heat and it needs to get it out safely, so that's why the fan is in there, and it actually shows a little icon here of the fan spinning. So I'm going to go ahead and unplug the AC output cord from the back, have this continue to go, and then I'm going to add some more devices on here to get that power output to climb a little bit higher. Alright, so I still got the little dipper going here, and I added in a laptop charger. I've got a laptop right up top here that is running a little benchmark, and it's not a super power hungry laptop. It is a gaming laptop, but the power supply for it maxes out at 150 watts. So we can see this is going to bounce around a little bit, but it's jumping around about 225 watts output between the two devices. And we're still drawing down since I've unplugged the charger, drawing it down about 93%, and it says it can still do this for another 2 hours or so. Now the next thing I'm going to do is load up the app so we can see a little bit more than this, and we can have some settings also dictate how the charging and stuff like that goes. So let me go ahead and grab that app and I'll be right back. Alright, so I've got the ECOFLOW app running here, and it shows you a list of all your devices. So here's our River 2 Pro, and it shows just at a glance we're sitting at 90% and it's connected. So let's go ahead and go into that one. And from here we can see we've got our input and our output. Similar to what's on the screen there, 0 watts input, 266 watts output. And it gives you a little graphical display here of where the power is coming from and where it's going to. So the little green blob in the middle is basically our batteries. So our batteries are just supplying power out to the AC right here at 256 watts. And we've got nothing coming in over the wall power and nothing coming in over our solar input. Now what I'm going to do next is I'm going to plug in this USB-C cable again. Now this is just coming from that 70 watt charger, and I'm going to plug it into the input here. And since it is a charger, it's going to know it needs to go in the USB-C and not use this as an output. And now we can start to see that input start to come in. And we now have a third option here that it's showing a DC input that wasn't there before of 70 watts. And that is going into the battery. And then of course we still have the output going out. Now the output of 250 watts is bigger than the input of 68 watts. So we are still going to show a decreasing number here on our hours that it's going to operate at, but at least now it's at 3 hours instead of 2 hours because we do have an input going into it. Now also right from the screen we have the options of turning on and off the AC and DC outputs. So just like the push buttons on the front of the screen, you can control that from the remote app. So it just gives you a real good picture right here all on one screen of everything that's happening. Now let's look at some of the advanced features here in the settings. So if we go into the settings app here, we can rename it. We can do a device share, which means I can send an email to somebody else so that they can log into this. And let's see what energy management is. So this screen allows us to change where the battery is going to charge all the way up to and where it's going to go all the way down to. So if we never wanted it to hit 0, we could drag this one up some. And then if we never wanted it to charge all the way to 100, we could drag that down some. In addition to that, we have the AC charging speed here, where if we didn't want it to charge at that full 940 watts, we could bring that down so that it would charge slower and maybe produce less heat in the meantime. And then we can change the same thing for the car input. Here, we can limit that down to 4 or 6 amps as opposed to the full 8 amps. We have a setting for the X boost, which will allow us to either turn on or off that boosted output, which basically doubles the output for a short amount of time on those AC ports. We have timeouts for the device itself, for the LCD screen, and for the AC. So if we wanted the AC to time out at a much lower or never, we can set that. And that's really nice in case you have some kind of a very low load that maybe cycles on and off. It may think that there's no load on there and it may turn itself off. So that's a nice feature. And then of course we've got feedback, user manual, that kind of stuff down at the bottom. So a lot of information, a lot of settings. You can get that dialed in. And it just gives you a way of looking at your batteries. Maybe I'm out of the house or I'm away from the campsite and I want to make sure that my solar charger is topping this thing off so I'll be able to use it all night when I'm camping. And it's just a nice way to be able to see it. Alright, so we looked at all the specifications of this, both the inputs and the outputs and the capacity. We tested it out with a couple household devices, both charging it and discharging from it, and we looked at the app, so now you've got a pretty good idea of everything that this thing is capable of and all the features it has. Now if you have any additional questions that weren't covered in this video, please go ahead and type them down in the comments below and I'll be happy to answer them. So I hope this video was helpful for you. I hope you found what you were looking for with it. If it was helpful, I appreciate a thumbs up. If you want to check out more reviews of different types of power stations, go ahead and check out my channel. I've got a playlist for power banks and solar generators. I'll leave links to all the nifty things you saw in this video down in the description below. I thank you as always for watching, and until next time, peace out and geek out.